Hello and welcome to the Physiology of Endurance Running podcast. We're back with another of our discussions about training zones. This is zone 3 or heavy intensity domain, but we'll sort of break that down. There might be actually some disagreement about the number of that zone, but yeah, we'll get to that in a minute. I'm joined by Dan as always. How's it going, Dan?
Good. Yeah. Seville training is going. I feel like I had a bit of a breakthrough today. 40K day, 5 by 3K in the morning, an average like 3 or 4K for them. I was pretty happy with that. Working too hard. It was definitely above marathon pace, but intensity, but not massively above. And then tried something that wasn't zone 3, which is quite rare for me in the evening. 3 by a mile, and then 5 by a K. Just mixing up my metric and imperial because I like that. Off 90 seconds rest for everything, so a bit more generous than I'd normally go. Like K's off 90 seconds, it feels quite generous. And ran 4:49, 4:44, 4:43 for miles, and then all the K's were somewhere between 2:52 and 2:54. So for me, that's pretty good going. That's some wheels for me. For someone who's got 2 fast twitch fibers, one in each leg, I was quite happy with that. But it's hard, isn't it? I do so much in like heavy intensity domain zone 3, and then you go and push yourself, especially when you're by yourself. They are the sort of sessions where you're getting, you're going above that threshold. The company is really appreciated, I find.
Yeah, it's a zone. It's a zone where I guess all of the zones there's like a psychophysiological factor, isn't there? But I guess I don't really know in the severe domain because I don't really spend much time there. But yeah, you do definitely appreciate if you're in a group running in this training zone. It definitely feels a lot easier than I think maybe it's a concentration thing in this zone because you're generally you can't be in the severe domain for more than a few minutes, but you could be chugging away in the heavy domain for 40 minutes and you just sort of zone out, you lose concentration, and then you see that K was 10 seconds a K slower just because you sort of zoned out and it still feels hard. But yeah, so there's
Yeah.
definitely a big psychological element, isn't
Yeah.
there?
I mean, those sessions you did with Jen versus ones you did by yourself in the build up to Valencia must have felt quite different, despite the paces being pretty similar.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I guess it's where like when you're I guess with this zone, when you come to practically using it in training, you are maybe paying attention to pace a bit more. Like for all of us, like we don't look at pace when we're jogging, do we? Like it's just a jog. Like we maybe have a heart rate where we're like, we don't want to go over that because that's getting away from the point of what we're doing. And maybe we're looking at time, but pace within reason doesn't really matter. Whereas once you're here, you do start to think about it because it is around race pace.
Absolutely. You're looking for those days where pace is high and heart rate is low, and you're thinking, yeah, this is a good day. And you're judging the success of that session by that relationship between heart rate and pace and effort as well. Obviously,
Yeah.
if it feels good, then that's nice. But yeah, and I guess that brings us to what we're going to cover in this episode. Continuing on from our training zone talk, or your guide to zone 2 episode, which launched last week, we're now talking about zone 3. My zone 3, not Owain zone 3, because we angle it a little bit differently.
So some of it's my zone 3.
Yeah, some of it, yeah, a bit of overlap, but what you would find in the scientific literature called the heavy intensity domain. So like between thresholds, LT1 and LT2. And if you don't know what that means, we'll get to that later in the episode. But that threshold zone, basically, where lactate is elevated but remains stable. And we're going to dig into all things about zone 3, like what's actually happening physiologically, like what the benefits that you'll get from this zone, and maybe what actually higher intensities are better for triggering certain adaptations. And I think one of the key things that I want to get across, which I think is misunderstood, is the idea that zone 3 or threshold is an intensity, not a speed, because you can modify the speed and the duration of your reps to still have a pretty similar physiological response. And I think that's something I'm really keen to get into. And this whole idea of like Jakob Ingebrigtsen is doing 25 by 400 in 64 seconds, which is obviously way above the speed he'd run for a half marathon, for example, but you look at his lactate and it's 3 millimole. Just that idea of we can manipulate training sessions to manipulate the physiological stress of that session through modifying intensity or speed and duration. So that's something I'm really keen to talk about. And also just get practical application. So how would you establish a zone 3 if you've got access to a lab? And what tools can you use if you don't have access to a lab? Because obviously there's going to be levels of precision you can have, but you can still be pretty accurate, I would say. Certainly with where that LT2, that second lactate threshold sits, I think you can pin that reasonably precisely without access to a lab. So we'd like to talk about that a bit. And then again, just applications of, right, now you know where your thresholds are. How do you go about executing a good zone 3 session to really get the most out of it and not overcook it, which very few people are undercooking sessions, aren't they? Most people are overcooking it. So how do you let go of the ego, pace it well, execute well, and get what you should out of that session?
Yeah, hopefully we get through all that.
We'll fly through.
So last week we launched our Patreon. There's a link in the show notes. There's going to be bonus episodes each week, us talking through our training, how we apply some of this, especially Dan in his build up to Seville. Me, I don't know what yet, but we'll figure it out. And then Jen's also joining us on there as before with our Road to Valencia series. And yeah, we've had really good feedback so far. I think we just wanted to thank a couple more patrons just for signing up. I'll take so thank you to Luke Beaumont. I'm going to assume he's from Australia based on the currency showing up on Patreon. But yeah, thank you, Luke, for signing up.
And I would very much like to thank Owain Davis, which I'm assuming is Welsh, based upon his name, but actually his email's got ES at the end, so maybe he's from Spain. I don't know. But thank you very much.
Let us know on Patreon.
Yeah, let us know. Send us a comment on Patreon. We'd love to know a bit about your backstory. We've got a little intro post there, which we would love to hear a bit about you, what you enjoy from a podcast as well, because we're really keen to get feedback on what you listeners would like, and that's very much where like Patreon can be a great tool. Like, we're here to make stuff that you want to listen to. So send us some comments on Patreon. You can join for free as well and have us still see what's going on and have a bit of interaction there. And if you think it looks like something worthwhile, then yeah, any support is greatly appreciated. So thank you so much to everyone who signed up so far. Now we need to move on to thanking Saw, right? Before I forget this time. So Saw, thank you very much for your support. We think you've produced really great products, as we always go on about. I'm really making the most of their kit at the minute, like training for Seville. So outside of running kit, I buy no clothes. Jemima buys my clothes because I'm still a kid, you see, and I don't care about clothes. But kit, I love kit, and I used to just make it last forever. You know, I remember starting uni, and I'd have shorts which were like 8 years old, barely fit me with holes in, and I'm a convert now. Like, nice kit makes such a difference, doesn't it? To like just the comfort, but also just the feel, like your self-confidence and the performance as well, especially when you're training in conditions like the minute where it's cold, but equally in the summer when it's boiling hot. So I think one of the learnings I've had over the last 15 years is of serious running is actually invest in your tools. Running is a cheap sport, and it should remain a cheap sport, but you will get so much better. You will feel so much better, have a much nicer time of it if you've just got one or two really nice items of clothing. So that's my pitch for Saw this week. Owain, what would you like to add to that?
Yeah, no, just to add to that as well. Like, yeah, you like, especially now, like shoes cost so much, and you know, like, yeah, you're spending, like, we're spending 10, 12 hours a week out running, so you might as well also wear something that's comfy. Just to emphasize it, I did a treadmill session this morning, and I know I go warm up outside. I don't want to warm up on the treadmill. And and I just like, I know by the time I'm on the treadmill, I'm just going to be in shorts. I'm actually in my sore shorts, but I just like chuck an old pair of like tights over the top, and then I was wearing actually my Valencia marathon t-shirt, which is like allegedly New Balance. I'm certain it's not New Balance. It's just a basic cheap t-shirt, and then like a quarter zip over the top. And I was jogging, and I was like, just feel clammy and like horrible, like running in this. Like it does, and it's because most of the time I'm wearing sore when I'm jogging about at the moment, or even doing sessions. And then I put this on, and there was like no good heat dissipation. I just felt like sticky and just not very nice running about in it. And I was like, I realized like we live a life of luxury now.
Oh God,
Having sore kit. Yeah, I don't think we can ever go back.
No, that's the problem. Now we're hooked, and you will too if you buy a pair of kit. And the other thing is, it lasts as well. We've some of the kit I've had for 18 months now, and it's the same as it was like brand new. Whereas like you pay 15 quid, 10 quid for a pair of shorts, and they're falling apart. Made in a sweatshop in China. Yes, just probably not. Goes against some of my values, I think. Sustainability, like fairness, and all of that.
We still want to chat with Tim, don't we? Tim Saw about sustainability, because I've heard him have like talk through it and really really articulate sort of the levels of sustainability, and how everything sort of contributes. And also he's like, I've heard him mention like about fixing sore gear, which like you wouldn't, again, like your race tee that you get for free, like you're not fixing that, it's just going in the bin. Whereas like there is also this feeling with sore, it's like, oh yeah, like of course, yeah, you can stitch it up if you need to, like keep it going. Which is just nice. It's just a nice approach. Like buying stuff for life is good. But yeah, check out Saw. We can't get enough of it, especially this time of the year where you need everything on your side, don't you, to get out in the cold and dark and
wet
rain.
Owen's told me he's after a jacket next. It's missing from his armory.
It was stepping out in in the valleys with you, and you're in your nice Saw jacket, and I was like, I've bought a I bought a knife to a gunfight here. I was outgunned for the first 10-15 minutes whilst it was chucking it down with rain, certainly.
Yeah, it does make a difference with kit. So yeah, thank you, Saw, for the continued support. Go check them out. Link in our show notes as per usual. So let's get into the main topic of today. So Zone 3, heavy intensity domain. I guess briefly, just want to do a bit of a recap. So if you haven't listened to last week, where we talked about Zone 2 training, or your guide to Zone 2, how would you go and define that? I'd maybe go and check that one out first. But if you have, not necessary, but probably a good place to start. It's supposed to be a sort of a series that you walk through in a sequence. But intensity domains are just a way of breaking up the intensities that you can run at effectively. And with intensity domains, you get different physiological responses dependent upon which domain you're in. And basically, there's moderate, heavy, severe, and extreme. And we're going to work through all of those over the course of this series. And today we're talking about heavy intensity domain. So that's how we'd go about it from if you were writing a paper talking about training intensity, you would talk about intensity domains. But coaches, quite rightly, break it up into training zones. And a good training zone system will be based around those intensity domains for all the reasons I said earlier. Like you get distinct physiological responses, training adaptations become more predictable if you're training in intensity domains rather than just, an X percentage of max heart rate, for example, or at speeds that are, we all know that 4 minutes a K is going to mean very different things to you dependent upon how fit you are at different stages of your development, even across like a month, a year, how fatigued you are. So using intensity domains is just a better way of doing it. But training zones should overlap those domains, I would say. Would you say that's fair?
Yeah, I think, I don't know if you were about to mention this, but like the intensity domains used in research are divided by quite, reasonably clear physiological anchor points that can be like shown through data, whether that's gas data or metabolic data, which is why they're then used, because in theory there's then it's quite clear the intensity that someone is operating at, especially when you're doing research saying like, oh, okay, like elite athletes do XYZ of each intensity domain. Everyone reading that paper has a good idea of what they're doing roughly. There's obviously some argument about them, like nothing's clear in physiology, and I think something we'll sort of mention is there's not a huge difference if you're a couple of percent either side of the boundary of that zone, the intensity domain. It's not like a huge change once you go through it. It's very discrete and it's all like linear. But yeah, that's how it's done in research. And then with training zones, as a coach or just as a self-coached athlete would apply them, I think what you're then looking to do is to take something where you can show it quite clearly with data and be quite confident on it, and then add like more nuance and more, I think, usefulness to that data. So we talked about it last week with like zone 2, but then also talking about like zone 1 and how we divide that up. And I mentioned that like I can just sort of feel like, okay, I know there's a certain rough, within a couple of beats where above that, I feel like I'm working a little bit harder. It's still easy, but I'm working a bit harder. And below that, I'm just really chilled out, like really, really easy. And I can just plod away all day and feel comfortable and just really, just an enjoyable experience. I can take in everything around me, and it's just a nice run. And adding that divide adds some like benefit for me as a runner to be able to like quantify what I'm doing and to better like prescribe it as well. Because when we talked about zone 2 and easy running and the moderate domain, like that goes from for you, we were saying last week, right, Dan, that goes from like 330 a k to walking. That's such a huge range, and that's actually not that useful. Like there's so much going on between those two absolute intensities.
No one's going to say that walking and running at 340 a k are the same thing. Even though the lactate is going to be identical, the heart rate isn't. So metabolically, things are the same or very similar, but there's obviously differences in terms of muscle fiber recruitment, just how hard it feels on a basic level. How long you could sustain that intensity for is different. So that's when training zones become useful, I think. But I would say that all good training zone systems are anchored around physiological anchor points. So VO2 max being one of them, some sort of second threshold. So whether that be lactate turn point, LT2, maximal lactate steady state, critical speed, being all like this intensity you could sustain for around an hour. And then a lower first lactate threshold, which normally is anchored just by the lactate threshold. We talked a lot about that in our last episode, but gas exchange threshold is also used. And they should anchor your zones. But then, as Owain just said, sometimes it makes sense to break up those intensity domains into more user-friendly chunks. And this is where it gets complicated, because although there's obvious definitions and agreements for breaking up the intensity domains, it's a bit of a wild west when it comes to training zones. Everyone does it a bit differently. There's 3 zone models, there's 5 zone models, there's 6 zone models, 7 zone models. Cyclists seem to just like adding more and more zones. I think 7 seems to be popular in cycling. I think 7 is excessive personally.
I'm trying to think, is it like 23 or so, like that just come as standard on Training Peaks, like 23 different zone models. So like and I think that's just the running ones. There's probably more when you get into cycling, and then swimming is just even more of a Wild West.
So this is where it becomes a little bit down to preference. I would also say there are definitely bad zone systems, and I think what zones you use, also how many zones you need, also depends upon what sort of population you're dealing with. I think the newer the runner, the less zones you need. You don't need quite so much nuance, and partly that's just because they've got less of a speed range available to them. If their VO2 max is at 5 minute K pace, then walking to 5-minute K pace isn't nearly as much of a range as I would be walking down to 240 a K pace. So I've just got more scope, more speed range to break up. So maybe it makes sense for someone who's running at faster speeds to break it up a bit more. And also just the experience level of the athlete, how much they are using those zones on a day-to-day basis. But I've sort of framing this in terms of the zones that I use. I do use a 6-zone model, which maybe is, I know I've criticized 7 as being excessive, and 6 is only one less, but I think that works quite well for someone who's operating at a good performance level and is interested in physiology. And as a practitioner, I like having 6 zones. And for me, zone 3 is just heavy intensity domain. So from those thresholds, but Owain likes to split the heavy in 2, which is not wrong, but but you can defend that if you like.
I think I think we'll leave the defense until we were going to do an episode about dividing up zone, and how we just apply it, won't we? So I think we'll leave it for.
Okay,
we'll leave it for that, because we're going to get into why I only have 5 zones and stuff. We'll be here 20 minutes and we won't go on to zone 3. So
yeah, fine. So so we're gonna wrap heavy. We're going to see, for the purpose of this episode, zone 3 and heavy intensity domain are the same. And I might slip up and just call it threshold, because for me, threshold is the same thing. For me, threshold isn't a distinct point. You've got thresholds, but if you're talking about threshold training, for me, that is being in the heavy intensity domain somewhere.
And I guess when you're saying that as well, there is, if you go and read some of the research, and we might link some in the show notes, that there is a training method called threshold training that shows up in research, which has a majority of your training in this zone as well. So just in case you look like threshold training research, that will be what shows up. It's not really something runners actually do. That's more like swimmers, isn't it? And I think cross-country skiers do that a lot as well. But that definitely shows up if you're looking at how research defines these zones. This is like what we're talking about in terms of this. You go from some anchor points to then so many interpretations and uses. But yeah, it's just worth bearing in mind as well that if you see a research paper with threshold intensity training, it will be something you probably shouldn't be doing as a runner.
Yeah, exactly. But I think the heavy domain is reasonably interesting, reasonably easy to understand, in that if you break it down into moderate, heavy, and severe, like we talked about moderate last week, moderate, like I said earlier, things are just not really that different from baseline. So if we looked at lactate, for example, your lactate at rest is going to be about 1 millimole. And in the moderate domain, even though the intensity has gone up, lactate is going to stay about roughly 1 millimole. There might be a slight rise, but not really a meaningful rise. Whereas in the heavy domain, there is a deviation from that homeostasis. So lactate is going to be elevated. You've now gone up to 2-3 millimole. But if you fix that in speed and hold an athlete at that speed for a prolonged duration, lactate is going to stabilize out. So you've gone past your first lactate threshold, you're above the moderate domain, your lactate's gone up to 3. But if we have someone on there for 5 minutes, or if we have someone on the treadmill for 20 minutes, it's going to stay at about 3 millimole. So there's a disturbance to homeostasis, but the body is capable of buffering that and tolerating that. And we talk about lactate a lot, but the same would be true looking at lots of different variables. You could look at phosphate ion levels in your muscle. You could look at muscle acidity. You could look at blood acidity. You could look at oxygen consumption, and also heart rate to an extent, in that it will stabilize out in the heavy intensity domain. But if you creep above that second threshold, like that LT2, you don't see this stabilization. So lactate, oxygen consumption, loads of different markers will just keep drifting out of control, basically, to the point where you're going to become exhausted quite quickly. So that is the overarching headline, is that heavy domain, there's physiological disturbances, but we can control them. They will stabilize out. Severe domain, so above LT2, we don't see the stabilization.
Yeah, I think a good like practical example of that is if like you've raced a 5K and especially if you pace it evenly, like your heart rate just keeps going up and up, doesn't it, throughout the whole race? Whereas if it's a big session, but if you go and do like 3 by 5K before a marathon, and if you pace it right, if you pace it right and your pacing's consistent, you'll just see your heart rate like be nice and stable throughout the reps. Like it'll rise across the first K, and then it should just be nice and stable. And that's just quite a nice little example of the same distance. You're still working quite hard for both, but one you're above that second threshold, one you're below it, and your heart rate behavior is completely different. We'll come on to talk about it, but I know that's one thing I use when I'm looking at like the athletes I'm coaching. If we don't have the data of where their LT2 is, but they've run a nicely paced session, and it's okay. What's your heart rate doing? Because that's quite a nice indicator of where if you're operating below LT2.
Yeah, exactly. And there's still going to be some drift in the heavy intensity domain, but it's just much less compared to being in the severe domain. Because obviously your heart rate is drifting upwards over the course of a marathon, but it's actually happening very slowly. Whereas, as you said, in a 5K, for me at least, it's every K, the heart rate is just going up. You're not seeing, like in a marathon, I'll have multiple Ks where the average heart rate is 162, 162, 162. Whereas in a 5K, it's going to go 162, 172, 182, and then peak at max heart rate, basically. So that's the difference, effectively, is like a overarching headline. So how are we defining the heavy intensity domain? Say we've got all the equipment available to us. How will we do that, Owain?
So I guess there's those two anchor points that we've sort of mentioned. So LT2, or also gets referred to as maximal lactate steady state, MLSS, or some researchers use critical speed. That's the top of the zone or the intensity domain. And then the bottom of the intensity domain is LT1, which we covered a lot last time. So that's first lactate or first ventilatory threshold. Again, that's sort of, there's different definitions, but generally like that first one is where you're seeing a rise in lactate from baseline. Some papers will do 2 millimole or 1.5 millimole above baseline, but you're seeing some perturbation to blood lactate levels above baseline, and then LT2 is the sort of maximal sustainable rate of lactate production or metabolic state.
Yeah, and I would how I typically define it is like LT1 in like really simply to someone who's never heard about LT1 and LT2 before. Like LT1 is just the highest speed you can run at with lactate pretty much being at resting levels, and LT2 is the highest speed you can run at where lactate is elevated but remains pretty stable over the course of a run. So it's that fastest speed you can operate at while still just about being in the heavy intensity domain and not crossing over into the severe. And like, as we've said, there's really predictable physiological responses if you are in the heavy domain. Like VO2 is not going to drift up that quickly. Lactate is elevated but stabilizes. And that is how we're going to go and measure that in the lab, normally by doing a submaximal test where you effectively measure their lactate response, as well as, if you've got the kit, like their respiratory responses to a range of submaximal speeds. And hopefully you do a few stages in the moderate domain, a few stages in the heavy intensity domain, and a few stages in the severe domain. So you can really characterize the physiological responses across those different domains and set the thresholds. That's how you should be going about it if you've got lab access. So we talk about lactate quite a bit, and should we jump in with a 2 and 4 millimole thing here? Is that, or should we leave that for a bit later? I think I've got that I penciled in for a bit later, thinking about it.
We'll come back to that, I think.
We'll come back to that. But 2 and 4 millimole you hear thrown around quite a lot. That moves me on then to moves us on to how can we sorry, I'm losing my train of thought here. I think this concept is important to nail down here, but as I said at the start, it's it's a range, it's a domain, it's not a discrete point. And I think that's often where there's some misunderstanding, where people go, right, threshold is about pace I can sustain for about an hour. But as we've already said, it's a range from LT1 up to LT2. So it is quite a wide block. And if you're in that range, that is threshold training for under my definition anyway. But also, as I said, we can manipulate, if we manipulate the length of a rep, we can operate at different speeds while still being in the same intensity domain and also still having the same physiological response. And I think this has become, I think some understanding and exposure of this has come from seeing like how the Norwegians train, and probably shouldn't be stereotyping just how Norwegians train, but like how the Ingebrigtsens train, how this popular system of using lactate guided training has come about, where they're often doing 6-minute reps in the morning and 3-minute reps in the afternoon. And this is a sort of training system I use quite a lot myself as well. But what you'll find is that if you manipulate the rep duration, you can run at different speeds or faster speeds whilst lactate being the same. And I would typically say that from my experience, if you're doing 6-minute reps, for example, you can probably run at marathon to half marathon pace, dependent upon what time you're going to finish those races in, and have, say, a lactate of 3 millimole. Or I could do 3-minute reps at probably like half marathon to 10-mile race pace, and my lactate is also going to be about 3 millimole. Or I could do 400s on a track at about 10k pace, and my lactate would also be 3 millimole. So although I'm running at different speeds, the metabolic response in the training zone is the same. I think that's where confusion happens. Is that what you see with people talking about it and athletes you talk to?
Yeah, and I think it's also just people just that they either from lab testing or just have a rough idea of like where their second threshold sits, and then they're just like, I'll just go bash my heart rate up to that and just hold it there as long as possible. And I think that's quite a blunt implementation of like a threshold session as well. I mean, I used to do it, and I would say like just having done a lot more training on a treadmill, where you can fix the pace. You then see like a different heart rate behavior. Whereas if you're outside, it's quite easy, just because you can't really accurately measure your pace, to just run hard for the first 2 minutes of the rep, get your heart rate up close to LT2, and then like probably slow down across the rep and probably across the session. So I definitely see that as well. And I think, like one of the notes here, and it will come up again when we talk about our application of this zone, is that it's a really wide zone. Like the bottom of the zone, you can be running for 3-4 hours, and the top of the zone is an hour. So that's quite a range of paces. If you just think about what pace you could run, for a lot of like good club runners, it's going to be 10-mile race pace, isn't it? And then marathon to like 50k. I think 50k is a nicer way of putting it, because people think slightly beyond marathon pace, and marathon pace is always like an ideal, isn't it? It's always I'm thinking, I'm in 2:29 shape, so what's that marathon pace? But actually, if you got me to think about 50k pace, it sort of gets rid of some logic. So I think go 50k and 10-mile pace, think about the difference, and everything in that is encompassed by this intensity domain.
Yeah, I would say on average there's a 2 kilometer an hour difference between LT1 and LT2, which is quite wide, like 20-25 seconds a K, 30-35 seconds a mile. So that is going to feel very different being at one end of that to another, especially when we're talking about high intensity. Just going, when you're trying to set your PB, you're not normally thinking about knocking 10 seconds of K off, are you? You're talking about knocking a couple of seconds of K off. So to have a zone that is 20 to 30 seconds of K wide is quite wide when you're talking about intensity, I think. I mean, my favorite is people labeling stuff threshold and Strava when it's just, you weren't hands on knees. It wasn't 10 out of 10 effort. It was probably a 9 out of 10 effort. So it's threshold training.
I think also like another sort of emphasis of the range of the zone is, we've done an episode about priming, right, before races, and if you wanted me to go run like a 10-mile race, or at that sort of LT2 pace, I'd probably want to do some priming before that. Whereas if I was doing a 50k, like I'd probably be thinking, okay, I might just jog, like I might actually save some energy as such for the race. So there's even like your approach and your psychological approach is quite different to both ends of the zone. So it is, yeah, like you say, it's a huge range, isn't it?
Yeah, but most people are just anchoring it right to the highest point they can, and still call it threshold, I would say. I think people are missing a trick in not using the whole zone and just spending time in those few seconds of K up to LT2. There's definitely benefits to working the whole zone, I would say. Should we move on to how you'd go about defining it if you haven't got access to a lab?
Yeah. Yeah, because I think this is, well, one of them's easy and one's harder. And we sort of discussed LT.
Go on. How would you go about LT2 then? Because that's the easy one, right? Easier one.
Yeah, so I think this is where so it still relies on good data. I think that's the first thing to say. Like if you're taking like wrist heart rate data, it's probably not going to be very good. So that, like, if where I've had athletes and I've tried to figure this out, that's my first question is, was this wrist heart rate data? And then like, was it evenly paced?
And just to jump data in there, you're talking about defining LT2 in terms of heart rate, not pace, because we've said pace is actually not a great tool in some situations. Obviously, if we know what your pace is when we're talking about longer sustainable stuff, that's great. What your threshold, your LT2 speed is. But what's probably more useful is having a heart rate gauge to go along with that.
Yeah, and I guess going away from the point a tiny bit, but like we still talk about the pace, but it's more like don't, especially like a few of the guys I coach now have done like a 10-mile, or like there's an 8-mile locally to us as well, which is useful for some athletes, and it's like that's a like absolutely don't go faster than this pace, because that's you like, especially if they've run that race really well, that's a like best tapered in, carb loaded, in their race shoes, racing people. That's the pace you went. You're not going to do that on your own in the dark, like training
in the context of a big training week, and probably not optimally prepared in terms of nutrition and tapered, etc.
But yeah, then in terms of I'm looking at it from heart rate, because I think that's probably the most useful. Paces has some use, but like we just said, it's best case. Whereas the heart rate, I'd be wanting to make sure it's not wrist heart rate, and then you're looking at that at an hour to an hour and 10 minutes sort of effort. So it depends on how fast a runner is as to whether that's like a 10-mile or a half marathon. But looking at like the average heart rate is one place to start, but then maybe I know for like my own races, I've sort of like taken out the first like mile or so, just where you've got that sort of like heart rate drifting upwards, because especially if you don't run that first mile too hard, like it sort of brings the overall average down, doesn't it? And then with that average, you then again have a rough ballpark of, okay, this is what you can sustain for an hour to an hour and 10 minutes. Don't go above this. It gets a bit harder once the race distance or race time gets a bit longer, right? Like that's where, you maybe take that and then go like, a couple of beats higher, I'd say, but then that's getting away from like a quite clearly measured effort.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just going to jump in with the cutting out the first mile. What about the last couple of miles where you're probably above threshold?
Yeah, you could do that as well, and some of it depends on the course as well. But yeah, no, that there is that as well. Like, you could just take the 10 miles in the middle, couldn't you, for a half marathon, and take that average. There's some nuance around it, like it relies on it being a well-paced race rather than, like if they've run 15K like cruising and then like picks up the pace by 15 seconds a K, it might not be as accurate. If there's a massive hill, partway through, that's going to potentially throw it out as well. But yeah, you
Yeah,
could just take the middle 10 miles, couldn't you?
yeah. I mean, I think like an all-out effort that is somewhere in the region of an hour, maybe it's 50 minutes, maybe it's 70 minutes. The average heart rate from that is going to be a pretty good anchor point, and at least a first starting point of where your threshold heart rate, your LT2 heart rate is going to sit. I mean, I'm probably textbooking, but I always average 170, 171 beats per minute for a half marathon, and my LT2 heart rate always comes out the same, 170, 171, 172, like the same ballpark every time. Just creepily predictable, I would say. But there is some people have more variation in heart rate as well. So I think it's having one marker is great, but looking at it over the course of a few races. And the other thing that I've done with athletes I've worked with is look what average heart rate they could sustain for a 10K and a half marathon and a marathon, and then you can sort of plot the duration against average heart rate to get a better like whole profile of what heart rate could you sustain for an hour, for example. And that just gives you more confidence in the numbers as well. So that's something you could go and do yourself if you've got that data already.
I would say where you're saying about like heart rates lining up as well, like just from personal experience, and I think we discussed this a few times on the Road to Valencia series, that like I at least, and actually we talked about it when we were talking about our heart rates for the marathon, weren't we? In a race where you're tapered and you've got some like race sort of state anxiety going on, like you might actually find you sort of get a couple of extra beats. Like I generally find my heart rate in a half is a couple of beats higher than it is in any lab test. Like pretty much all of my lab tests have said 175, 176 for LT2, but then in halves I'm holding like 177 for 72 to 75 minutes. So in those races, I get a couple of beats extra. In training, I'm never going to like 177. I just know as soon as if I go above 175, it's too hard. So there's then that like layers of nuance you can add once you know yourself or know the athlete you're working with as well, isn't there? Which I think is just, not talking about intensity domains here, but just always constantly reflecting on what you're doing and the data and the context the data's come from, and the sort of qualitative data around a quantitative piece of data, I guess.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think that's when you can bring in other tools. And I think one that's underrated and is super, super valuable is just RPE, like rating of perceived exertion. I just like to keep it simple and not use this 6 to 20 Borg scale RPE. I think there's a rationale behind it, which I'm not going to go into detail, but athletes, from what I see, just understand 1 to 10 a bit more easily, and I allow people to have a half score as well, so we go 5.5, 6.5, etc. And I typically see LT2 comes back as a 7 out of 10 effort, and LT1 comes back as a 5 out of 10 effort. And I would say a threshold session should never be over a 7 out of 10 effort on average. And that's what I would normally, because I like the fact that my new Garmin has got the fact that you can rate how hard you found the session out of 10. And for me, I'm normally giving them a 7 out of 10 if it's a threshold session. But now I'm biased though, because I think it should be a 7 out of 10. And so maybe I just put 7 out of 10 down. But all the athletes that I coach, if they haven't got threshold testing, I'm normally going, right, this is a threshold session, you're a 6 or 7. Sometimes I probably wouldn't want them to go much past a 7 anyway in terms of effort on a threshold session. And sometimes that tells you a lot as well. If it's feeling really hard but your heart rate's quite low, that is valuable information in yourself. But say it's a normal day and you've got this heart rate that you've set as LT2 based upon your training history and your data that you've got. If that's matching up with it as a 7 out of 10 effort in general, then I think you've probably got it about right. If you're finding that actually you could go at this all day, you're only a 5 or 6 out of 10, maybe it's you need to reassess where your heart rate is. And equally, if you just can't get to that heart rate in training, that's probably not a threshold heart rate either. People who have, and I've seen it, people have been given lab tests which have been interpreted poorly, and they've put LT2 like 10 beats higher than it should be. And they're just struggling to get to these heart rates in training. Well, LT2 is hard, but it's not super, super hard. So you should be able to access those intensities in training, unless you're super, super fatigued.
We briefly, well, we mentioned on last week's episode, LT1. That's a lot harder to figure out without a lab, isn't it? I'm trying to remember how we came to the conclusion. I know I said go run Barry 40 because that came out bang on my LT1. What was the other? Did we even end up giving a way of figuring out LT1?
I can't remember. I
think that probably suggests we didn't.
Before, just to fill some time whilst Owain has a think. I'd have a couple of more points on LT2, and I think one of the key ones is, in addition to RP, is just for breathing, and that you should see a step change in your breathing as you cross from the heavy into the severe intensity domain, because there's like physiological reasons for this. Because as soon as you tap into the severe domain, you're going to see an upregulation in your glycolysis, so your anaerobic system. And one of the byproducts of that is lactate. And how we buffer lactate is it combines with bicarbonate in our blood to produce CO2 and water. And the CO2 we breathe out. And CO2 also just drives our breathing response anyway. How deeply we breathe is directly proportional to how much carbon dioxide is in the blood, because we've got sensors in the blood that are measuring CO2 levels and also acidity levels. And so once you go past threshold, you will have a noticeable uptick in your breathing response, and you'll start to ventilate a bit heavily. You'll breathe deeper, but I think mostly it's the frequency rather than the depth of the breathing. So that is a good cue to pay attention to as well. One tool that I think science is good, something practical they've brought to the table in this field, is this idea of critical speed and critical power, which is very popular in cycling. And the concept basically is that the speed that you can sustain for a 5K, 10K, half marathon, etc., if you plotted them on a curve, it's not linear, it's curve linear. So the speed you can sustain for 400 meters drops quite quickly when you come to an 800 meters and to a 1500 meters. But as you get to a 5K and a 10K and a half marathon, that curve flattens out. And the asymptote of that curve is where your critical speed sits. And there's a really good relationship between critical speed and your lactate turn point, or LT2 speed. I'd say the critical speed tends to sit just above your LT2, and that's what the literature suggests as well. But they're very closely related. And a lot of research papers use critical speed as their marker of the breakpoint between the heavy and severe intensity domain. So I've produced a calculator which you can access on Patreon, either by signing up or just paying for it. I think it's £3 plus VAT for just to get it as a single product. And you can basically add in some time trials or your recent season's bests or PBs, and from that it will quantify both your critical speeds but also training zones wrapped up to that, because you can use then that critical speed as an anchor point of, well, where does LT1 normally sit relative to critical speed? The other great thing about the critical speed calculator, or critical speed model in general, is that it gives you, it enables you to predict performance in that severe intensity domain. And by severe intensity domain, in practical terms, it's the 5K, the 3K, the 1500 meters. If you've got enough data points, then you can very accurately predict the average pace that you could sustain for anything in that domain. So from that, you can estimate your speed at VO2 max as well. So there's a description on Patreon that you can have a look at, and if you like it, you can sign it. You can go and buy that as a single product, or equally, if you Google it, you'll probably find a good guide to how to calculate it yourself. I've just done the maths for you and built a nice little Excel sheet because, as we discussed before, I love Excel. So that's a good tool. So, Owain, how are we defining LT1 then?
I don't think we gave anything. I think we talked about percentages of like max heart rate.
Yeah,
And then the talk test as well was
yeah,
our other guide. Oh no, and we said if you're running and you get to a traffic light and you feel like you need to stop, you're probably above LT1. Was
yeah,
our guide. So yeah, I guess that that's just a different version of like the talk test, isn't it? But I think that speaks to how hard it is to define LT1, and even in a lab with a lab test, it can sometimes be difficult depending on the athlete. Like you know, like I get, we mentioned where maybe zones apply less for like slower runners. I think you've maybe also seen with like, I guess you'd say sprint into middle distance runners, so the 4-8 type runners, sort of just immediately produce lactate, right? So you don't really get a nice sort of lactate curve that you can show an LT1 on for those types of runners either. So it does slightly depend, and it's maybe a bit harder to actually locate as well.
yeah, yeah. I think I agree. It's much more difficult. There's no real good field test unless you want to go and do a 3.5, 4 hour time trial and see what your average heart rate is for it, where your LT1 sits. For me, I think going back to that RPE is a great starting point. And as I said, most people report LT1 as a 5 out of 10 effort. When I've got nice clean data in the lab looking at their lactate response, that higher speed they can run at without lactate accumulating tends to be a 5 out of 10 effort. But there is variability there. People who are that more middle distance profile, like you were talking about, because they can just produce so much lactate, they can run at so high a speed, they're actually not having to recruit that many muscle fibers to run at in their zone 2. They often report it even like a 2 or 3 out of 10. So that is a caveat if you're working with that sort of demographic or you are that sort of population, that maybe your RP is skewed a little bit. So I think the most important thing though is it just feels easy, isn't it? For your easy days. We've done a whole episode on your guide to zone 2. So if you want to go, if you haven't listened to that already, go check that out.
Should we talk about some of the physiological characteristics and I guess they lead quite nicely into the benefits when you talk about them, don't they? Of training in this
Exactly.
intensity
Yeah.
domain.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
yeah. So I guess we've mentioned lactate a lot. So there's an equilibrium that you see when you're in this zone, and it's going to depend on where in the zone a bit you are, but there is more lactate being produced. As we mentioned, you're above LT1, so your lactate levels are going to be above baseline, but it's not just going off the charts and it's not unsustainable. So there's an equilibrium. I think that's sort of, I guess, for everything, all of the physiological responses that are then seen in the data is something's happening, but it generally reaches that equilibrium, doesn't it? So yeah, oxygen delivery and utilization is the same. We sort of talked about that. VO2 will rise, but then level off. You're generally still using type 1 muscle fibers, but you do recruit more type 2 fibers, sort of, especially as the bout goes on. I think that's maybe some nuance again, like the duration starts to play a factor, especially with that. And then, mitochondrial respiration. Again, it's upregulated from that easy zone 2 training, but it's still not unsustainable. I guess maybe also another important one, especially if you go to the lab, is like, and you get this data, is fat oxidation rates. You're still oxidating some fat at the sort of bottom of the zone, but then once you get towards the top, it's just completely gone, hasn't it? And that's where you see that RER of 1 being hit as well. And that's another sort of guide of when you're above LT2 if you're in the lab. That's where you're not utilizing any fat at all at that point.
Yeah, like your peak fat oxidation rate is going to occur below LT1, but as soon as you cross that LT1, you'll see that fat oxidation rates start to drop reasonably quickly. And by the time you get to the top of the heavy intensity domain, they're typically at 0. You're not burning any fat. Almost all your energy is coming from burning glycogen. I think one thing I was just going to add there is that the reason we start to produce lactate, I think often people think it's because we can't get enough oxygen to the muscles. And that's not the case. There's enough oxygen there, but we can't exclusively rely on aerobic metabolism to match the energy demands. And that's why we're starting to produce lactate, because glycolysis can happen just more quickly because it doesn't need to get oxygen to the system. So by glycolysis, I mean the anaerobic system. It is great because it's really quick. You don't need to get oxygen from the atmosphere through the blood to the muscles for it to metabolize carbohydrates. And so when we can't quite match the energy demands purely from, for example, burning fats and carbohydrate using oxidative phosphorylation, that's when we need to tap into that glycolysis. So we see this upregulation in glycolysis. Lactate starts to be produced, but then other muscle fibers can use that lactate as a fuel source as well, because lactate is just a form of carbohydrate. So the brain, for example, loves burning lactate. But just as maybe a bit of a side note, but also I think it's important when you're understanding the physiological process. That's why we're seeing these distinct patterns. It's that the muscles just can't quite rely purely on aerobic metabolism to produce the energy you need to run at the pace that you're demanding that your muscles put out, basically.
And I think when you start to think about the physiology that's being utilized, that's, it's maybe not it's maybe too simplistic, but it gives an idea of also the training benefit of the zone. I think in general, like if you're using something, it's probably also training it. Generally, there's going to be things that where that isn't the case, and there's things where that definitely is the case. But all of those, I guess, like physiological responses are contributing to the benefits. So I guess I don't know. I maybe still want to start with the muscle fiber recruitment and then training, because I think this is where where we talked about like rep length, that becomes a really interesting tool to utilize, doesn't it? Like where we were saying that you can run, like the Ingebrigtsens are doing like, they're doing like 400s, right? That's threshold training. So for them, that's probably just above 60 seconds and running really fast. They are definitely using type 2 muscle fibers to run that fast. Therefore, they're training them, but metabolically, they're staying within the threshold intensity. So as you recruit more muscle fibers and those type 2 muscle fibers, they are also going to be being trained by recruiting them. If you don't recruit them, they're not going to be trained generally with muscle fibers.
Yeah, that's the golden rule, really, when it comes to muscle, is that you only train the fibers you recruit. So zone 2 is great, but one thing you're definitely not going to train is your fast twitch muscle fibers. And fast twitch muscle fibers is a spectrum. So it's not just, right, you use your fast twitch fibers for sprinting and your slow twitch fibers for endurance. You've got type 1, then you've got type 2A, and you've got type 2X fibers. And if you're doing a squat, for example, like full 1 rep max squat, you're recruiting every single one of those fibers. If you're just easy running, you're doing just your type 1 fibers. If you're in this heavy intensity domain, you're starting to use those type 2A fibers to put out the intensity you need. And that's partly, again, why we're starting to produce some lactate, is that these type 2 fibers aren't as developed aerobically, and they're much more likely to use glycolysis as a energy pathway. But if you recruit them and you train them in this aerobic fashion, their aerobic capacity at the muscle level improved. So they get more mitochondria, and the quality of those mitochondria also increase. So yeah, definitely, like, you only train with fibers you recruit. And I think that is, like you said, Owain, that's a really nice way to go about training those like more fast twitch fibers, but in an aerobic fashion, by doing things like 400 meters off 30 seconds rest, or even Ks. I think you can run at an intensity that is faster than your pace you could sustain for about an hour, that steady state intensity, and recruit some of those fast twitch muscle fibers, but keep that metabolic response under control.
Yeah, and I think the other reason to talk about muscle fibers first is because it also brings in the sort of intensity and durability sort of sliding scale, and the sort of like combined levers that you're probably looking to pull if you're doing more threshold training, right? Because where you need to recruit a muscle fiber to train it. So I'm sure there's some people that heard that and were like, oh, I'm just going to smash out some sprints because that will recruit all of my type 2A and X muscle fibers. but you're going to do 40 seconds of work across that session, and you're not going to be, well, you're going to be using all of your muscle fibers, but not, not nearly to the same degree as if you do 30 to 40 minutes of threshold training, where over time you are still using a lot of those type 2 muscle fibers, but you're also using all of the muscle fibers for a lot longer and getting a bigger training dose. So I think that's where it's quite an interesting training intensity zone, because it sort of combines the zones either side of them, right? Like it combines some of the elements of zone 2 in that easy running where it's just a lot of volume, and then the severe domain where there's a lot less volume but potentially more like signal coming from it. And this is that meeting point, and I guess this is where we're interested in it, right? Because there's an element of like experimentation and figuring out what works. Maybe if you just want the answer, it's not as interesting, but like you need to figure out the right dose and response, and within the dose, the intensity and duration balance, which I think is, for me and for you and probably for a lot of people listening, is really interesting.
Yeah, exactly. I think there's obviously an interaction between intensity and duration, because as you said, like doing 10-second sprints, that's going to recruit all your muscle fibers, but you're not going to get a massive training benefit from that just intuitively. Likewise, just going out for a jog is going to give you some nice adaptations, but you're obviously leaving stuff on the table in terms of intensity there. So somewhere there's probably this sweet spot, and it's been hypothesized that heavy intensity domain maybe is that sweet spot. I would say, based upon the popularity at the minute of threshold training and how much success is coming off of a threshold training approach for most of the sessions, a la Jakob Ingebrigtsen, I think there's anecdotal evidence to say, yeah, it's not going to give you everything, but it gives you a lot of the good stuff.
Yeah, and I guess also where we've talked about like physiology happens on like a continuum, and it's not like big jumps. And we sort of mentioned last time with zone 2, like it seems to provide some signal, but it's not a very big signal for adaptations. And then severe domain, 5K race pace is a lot of signal, but you can't do much of it. And yeah, this is just in that middle, that sort of, that middle ground. And you can probably do everything, and yeah, maybe it takes longer, but generally, like, you're thinking long term anyway, and you're thinking across a years and decades sort of thing, aren't you? So it's actually, if this means you can train sustainably for longer, that's where the real like benefit lies.
Yeah, and we talked about this paper last week. Heavy, severe, and extreme, but not moderate intensity exercise increased VO2 max and thresholds after 6 weeks of training, and they basically found a stepwise increase in the VO2 max response you get, and also threshold response in terms of the improvements from going from moderate to lower heavy domain to upper heavy domain to severe to severe intensity, and that every time you increase your intensity, you get a better response. But then you've got to look at, well, yeah, how much? What is the difference between doing a heavy intensity domain, a zone 3 session, versus doing a zone 4-5 session? And if you see that actually there's not much of a difference in the VO2 max or thresholds response, but you've got all these downsides of you're risking your sustainability in terms of picking up an illness, overtraining, picking up an injury, and also just in hampering how much training volume you can do, because you just can't get out and do the same amount of easy stuff the next day after going really, really hard as you can after doing something that's more controlled. Actually, long term, that's probably where the benefits of working in the heavy intensity domain compound. That's where I sit, I think. And I think we're now moving from evidence-based into hypothesizing and anecdotal experience, and also just looking at what people are doing. Because I think the literature would say, well, more intensity is always better in terms of the signaling response. But training is a complex system. And as you said, all things aren't equal just by increasing intensity. It has a knock-on effect on so many other factors: recovery, like overtraining risk and injury, etc., etc. It's just going to sacrifice your ability to just go out and train again the next day.
Yeah, and I guess it's we've talked about some potential benefits, but it's hard to categorically say what this training zone does, because how do you isolate this training zone? Even like cellular signaling, sort of, you can measure it to a degree, but you're not necessarily measuring that like one dose of training. Like things like sort of glycogen state are going to influence the signaling. Like that was one of the things that came up with zone 2 training, was like if you deplete glycogen, it does seem to slightly increase signaling. So that the state that you're going into a training session can impact the signaling to produce adaptations long term, and it's just really hard to isolate that. So you sort of speculate, and I guess again you look like there's some work on what zone 2 does, and then there's some work on what severe intensity training does, and then it's probably somewhere in the middle, and you just have to infer a bit and look at what like elite athletes are doing as well.
Exactly. I think it's not saying that science is wrong. It just hasn't got the whole picture, because we discussed this last time. You just you can't control every variable in real world training. There's so much going on. It's not just what you're doing with training, it's the lifestyle outside of it. And also it's not how fit can you get in 6 weeks, it's how fit can you get in, well, if you're a professional athlete, like 5 years, 10 years. And that's a very different challenge. I guess we're both like big advocates of threshold training, and I think a lot of any of our athletes that we coach will know that we don't just exclusively give threshold, but it's definitely a big part of it. And it's as we discussed in the Road to Valencia series, especially in like that recap afterwards, almost all of our intensity work, everything that wasn't easy, was threshold stuff. So if you do want to go and hear more about that, then check out our Road to series, either the Road to Valencia or our Road to 2026, which is going on to Patreon. How would you go about recommending sessions, and how would you execute a session? So you've got a new athlete, Owain, they've been to a lab, you've got their LT1, LT2. How would you then go about saying, right, this is how you execute a threshold session?
I guess it depends on the context they're training for, right? Like a sort of where we're saying this whole zone is threshold training. If they're training for a marathon, that's a lot different to, I think, what we would maybe call just pushing your thresholds. Again, this is where it gets into training talk a bit, sort of session discussion, but I know like my sort of default outside of like marathon training is just, well, let's just push your thresholds higher. And like it's only going to be a benefit, and I think a sustainable way to train. But probably starting 30 to 40 minutes of work, depending on their like weekly training and their experience of doing sessions. I would probably pick something within like a 3 to 6 minute range for like reps, because I think that's not too long a rep to be like boring or like be intimidating, but it's not so short that you can like rag it. I think is important. And then at least with the athletes I coach, I generally say to them like, okay, if your LT2 is 170, actually for, if they're doing 6x6 minutes, for the first 3, don't go above like 165 for the heart rate. And just so you're not going into that pitfall of just, okay, I've got to be at 170 for the entirety of as much of this session as possible. Like I would rather see them do the whole session with an average of like 165. I think that's a better way of executing the session. And I guess like, I've mentioned like training on a treadmill, where you can like fix the absolute intensity that you're running at, and then your own like internal work sort of rises across the session to match that, I think is another nice way of doing it. Yeah, you've put in the notes as well, like, yeah, start with longer reps before the sexy threshold sessions, which I'd agree with. I think, like, yeah, like, I know that, you do them, like the Ingebrigtsens do. I think you take them to more extreme, and like you've obviously had, like Brady from Inside Running was really keen to work with you because of some of these sessions, right? But like,
Oh yeah, I've done 3400s off 30 seconds. I think I've done 5200s before as well.
Yeah, it's really hard. Like, I've tried doing it myself, like minute reps on the treadmill. It's really hard to figure out the intensity to get it right. And yeah, I think that's then just an easy way to get it wrong. I think also you just need to approach the session with the right sort of attitude in terms of, like, you're accumulating work and you ideally want sort of as short a rest as possible to keep accumulating that work. So like if you go down to your club session and you try and do like 25 by 400 off like 20 seconds recovery, that's, like it might just be harder because of the context of what everyone else around you is doing as well. So there's things like that to consider.
Well, I think I do like starting with the longer reps, but I think one of the great tools that you can use is having short recoveries. And if you can't keep putting out the same pace, for example, doing 6-minute reps off a minute recovery, if you need more than a minute recovery, then you're above your threshold, I would say. To an extent, like if you're going really extreme and going, right, you're doing 10 by 6 minutes, which is something I've done, and it is just hard at the end because you accumulate so much work. But most people aren't starting with that. They're starting with something like 4 to 5 times 6 minutes. And if you can't do 5 times 6 minutes off a minute and be actually okay at that intensity, then you're above your threshold, unless there's something else going wrong in your training or your health status. Yeah, I mean, I always agree. I always say start at the bottom of your LT1 and work up to your LT2, because pace might increase a little bit, but actually, because heart rate does lag with intensity, especially in those early reps, you'll see that heart rate is going to be quite low to start with. And if you really try and force, your LT2 heart rate is 170 and you try and get it up to 170 with first rep, you'll find that you have to slow down on the following reps to make sure you keep your heart rate in the same place, which is not the goal. Because I think this is something people get confused about. The goal, the heart rate is a tool to control intensity. It's not the purpose of the session, because it's not your heart you're really trying to develop. It's more the muscles, the peripheral system. That is how that is the main adaptations we're after, is peripheral adaptations. So mitochondria in the muscle, capillarization within the muscle. Yeah, you might get a bit of a VO2 max boost, especially if you're reasonably naive to intensity. But the heart rate is just a tool. It's not about trying to get your heart rate as high as you can in these sessions. VO2 max work is different. You want to try and get your heart rate pretty high. But just the heart rate. Yeah, heart rate is a tool to guide intensity, not the outcome of the session.
Yeah, and with that as well, I'd say, like, once you're getting into longer sessions, like 45 minutes plus, like, you probably don't want to be seeing that LT2 heart rate until like the very end, and probably even not seeing it at all. Like, I know if I'm doing like an hour and 10, hour and 20 minutes worth of work, it's probably like at least, even on the last, the end of the session, it might be like within 5 beats of LT2, but it's just going to be lower. And like a lot of that's on, based on just, cardiac drift, and if I fueled well enough and if it's warm, is going to be pushing it up. Like where I've done sessions and it's cold, it's definitely 5 beats sort of below LT2, just because you're doing more work. So you can't really sustain that higher heart rate for as long. So I think that's something else to bear in mind as well, especially if you're utilizing this for marathon training and doing, 3 or 4 by 5K. Like, maybe if you're doing 3 by 5K, on that last 5K, your heart rate is approaching LT2, but for the first 2, it definitely shouldn't be.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree with that. I mean, like, I've also put in here in the notes, like, challenges to doing zone 3 or threshold training. I mean, obviously the sides are like just knowing where your thresholds actually sit. so many people are training in a group with their club, which is great, but then ego comes into it, doesn't it? It's so easy just to get drawn along, go out a bit too aggressive. I think also just like trusting the process. If you've a lot of people have gone from doing lots of high intensity training, and it's the belief that actually going a bit easier might give you more benefit in the long term. That's a bit counterintuitive, isn't it? I would say, in that not like no pain, no gain. So, but if I'm going easier, aren't I going to get as much benefit? And I would say that, yeah, all things being equal, if you're doing 6 by 5 minutes at zone 4, zone 5 versus 6 by 5 minutes in zone 3, you are going to get more benefits from the intensity. That's what the science says. But that is all things being equal. And in reality, you could probably now go and do 8 times 5 minutes, 8 times 6 minutes, 8 times 6 minutes, and it feel easier, you recover better, and you can do more mileage across the week, and you can stack more sessions on top of each other and just have more consistency. So I think that's really where zone 3 comes into its own.
Yeah. On that, have you ever done more than like a 5 or 6 minute rep at the pace you run a half marathon at? Like, if you've done a rep and then like a month later you run a half marathon, how close do you get to that pace?
Yeah, I mean, for me, I tend to not go much over a K, so like 3 or 4 minutes at half marathon pace. I don't know, I'm trying to think back now. I mean, this morning I did 5 by 3K, like threshold, but that was close. That was much closer to marathon pace than half marathon pace.
Yeah, and that's going to be like 10 minutes, right? 9-10 minutes.
Yeah.
Of a rep. Yeah, so I think that's something like, yeah, with a couple of athletes I've worked with, and even myself, like I don't, I maybe got within 1 or 2 seconds a K of what I ran a half marathon in, but that was on like 3 or 4 minute reps. Anything above that, I wasn't getting within like 3 or 4 seconds a K. Realistically, across a session, like across a session average, like where, yeah, you might get a bit of a favorable GPS reading, like in a bit of like Butte Park for us, like where the park run starts. But actually, being realistic, but taking a step back and averaging across the session, I'm not within 4 or 5 seconds a K of what I then run a half marathon at. So you just have to trust that it's gonna be better on the day, which is really hard to do, and it's probably a lot of the discussion I have with the guys I coach is you just have to trust, like, and it's hard. And it's hard, and especially when the data isn't coming directly from lab tests where we've inferred it. So there's already a trusting the data and then having to trust what the training outcome is. It's hard to do, but it's not
going back to what I experienced as a club athlete. You would turn up to a session and it'd be like, we're doing 5K pace reps today. The longer stuff might be 10K pace stuff. You're very rarely doing half marathon stuff, and it'd be completely unheard of to do anything slower than half marathon pace for your quality day of the week. So to go out and doing 6 minute reps at marathon pace, or maybe just slightly faster, I don't think comes naturally to, again, that idea of no pain, no gain, and just what traditionally people are doing in the club scene.
Yeah, it's a hard sell, and some people just straight into it, and other people it's a lifetime of I guess it's just hard, isn't it? It's just hard to have a degree of separation from what you're doing and the outcome. But I don't know, I guess if you go in knowing that might be the case, maybe it's easier to deal with. I think there was one more tip which we sort of mentioned, but like monitoring, like looking at the patterns of heart rate across sessions. And I think that's where I definitely use it with some of the guys I coach. And again, you need to be like realistic in terms of like, okay, did you take the same recovery on each rep? Did you run them fairly evenly paced? There wasn't a massive like headwind on one of them, sort of thing. But yeah, like looking at patterns and seeing that your heart rate is fairly stable across the session for the same rough pace output is a pretty good sign that you're below LT2, especially if you're doing more than 30 minutes sort of work. Whereas, yeah, if you know, like you were just saying, if you did like 4 by 5 minutes at like above LT2, your heart rate's just going to keep going up and up.
Exactly, yeah, yeah. But I also think repeating the same session again is really valuable, because then you do learn how to execute. Because even I'm like this. If I'm trying out something new, the chances are I'm going to be a bit too aggressive in those early reps, and might be forced to slow down a little bit. Or actually, what I tend to do is just cut the session short, because I've got to LT2. If I'm going to keep going, I'm going to work too hard. I prefer just to stop there and try again another day than really force the point and put too much fatigue in the system. So you learn how to execute a session by doing it a few times. And if you look at, we've talked about Jakob already too much, but I think he said somewhere that he's done 25 times 400 meters off 30 seconds rest every week of his life, that since the age of like 12 or something ridiculous. I'm sure, that's probably a bit hyperbole, and that obviously he's had down periods, but he's not afraid to do the same session pretty much every week of the year. So there's something you can learn from that, I think.
I think that's where you're thinking about the training goes less from like, oh, I'm doing this 5K, so I need to do this, to I want to accumulate X amount of work at Y intensity. And once you go to the latter, it's very easy to just become, okay, like 40 minutes, how do I divide this up? And generally you end up going back to the same things as well, I find. Certain rep lengths work their way into 30 to 40 minutes easier than others. So
yeah, I'm not giving people 7-minute reps or 2.5-minute reps typically. Right?
Yeah. So yeah, you just end up doing the same stuff, don't you? Which again, I think is easier once that mindset changes of ticking that physiological box of accumulating that work and then moving on to your easy run. You're sort of less worried about how you're less thinking like, oh, I'm doing a 5K, so I need to do 5 by a K. Once you get away from that thinking, I think it helps.
Yeah, definitely. Let's just before we wrap up, I've got a few limitations of heavy intensity domain training to go through, and I think just reinforcing the point that I think we've made already, that heavy training is great. We're big believers in it, but you can't get everything from just zone 3 threshold training. There are definitely times where you should be doing more intense training. And I guess the key one that I'm talking about here is like more VO2 max development. Yes, you can get VO2 max development from threshold training, but it does seem that higher intensities are more effective for that more central adaptation versus the peripheral adaptation. And that's because VO2 max is primarily limited by the size of your heart, the amount of blood that you can pump around the system. So if you want to challenge your cardiovascular system, you need to work at higher percentages of your VO2 max, higher percentages of your heart rate max to really drive like the preload, which is basically a fancy name for the pressure that's going into the heart, which helps increase the size of a left ventricle, which is the side of the heart that distributes blood to the periphery, so your muscles, and also increase the thickness of the left ventricle as well. So you get a bigger lumen, a bigger chamber, but also a stronger chamber as well. So you can pump more oxygenated blood out to the body in a single beat. And that's the primary way in which we improve VO2 max. It's not the only way. There are peripheral adaptations as well. And things like going to altitude can improve the oxygen carrying capacity of the blood. But most of the changes come from the central cardiac changes that you see with training. And there's pretty good evidence to say that the higher the intensity to a point, the more benefit you're going to get in terms of VO2 max. But again, there's still that trade-off. You don't necessarily need to be at 100%. Well, you probably don't need to be at your 100% of your VO2 max to really maximize that. And this is probably when I'm stepping ahead of myself before we start talking about severe intensity training in the next few weeks. But that is something where threshold training can give you a bit of that stimulus, but probably not maximizing that response if you really want to drive that VO2 max upwards. And for some people, you don't. I'm one of these. My VO2 max is high enough already. I don't need to worry about it. It's 80 mil per kilogram per minute consistently. That's plenty high enough. So again, that probably biases why threshold training works well for me. And I think most people aren't primarily limited by their VO2 max, but there are instances where actually that is the main thing limiting them. They've got their threshold already super, super high in terms of it's sitting very close to their VO2 max already. There's nowhere else for it to go. So doing that sort of stuff can be really, really unlock the next step for that kind of athlete.
Yeah, I think we've covered it. Well,
I had a couple. I had one more. I wasn't sure if you were going to jump on that then.
No,
but
you go for it.
I think also just like the exposure to high intensities. So like we can drive up. Just everyone's taking bicarb these days. I'm not. I don't really like it. It doesn't get on with me. But a lot of people are. It's very popular and it does work. But actually, the body has its own natural bicarb buffer in the blood, and so by doing more intense training. And now we're probably talking about more like 800 meter, 1500 meter pace training. So transitioning maybe from the severe into the extreme intensity domain, that can improve that ability to tolerate high acidity levels and better buffer those capacities. And also like that just that neuromuscular adaptations you get from doing sprint training and faster work, even strides, you'd be lumped into that bracket. I mean, I've, if you've been a long-term listener, I think one of the things that I commented about doing Barcelona half marathon last year, where I ran a PB, I was expecting a bigger PB and basically found that cardiovascularly I was great. My heart rate was under control, but my legs were just not familiar with running sub 3 minute or trying to run sub 3 minute K paces for 21K. And so I probably hadn't just touched enough of those higher intensities to really condition the neuromuscular system for fast running. So you do need that when you're approaching those faster races, the 5K, the 3K, etc. Even a 10K to an extent. I think you can get away with it a bit more in a 10K, but when you're talking 5K and faster, I definitely feel like I need a little bit, not loads, but a little bit of stimulus, even though my VO2 max is great. Just that exposure to high metabolic stress is needed. And just for the psychological preparations as well, I think it's a big shot going from threshold training into, right, you're going to race a 5K.
Yeah, I definitely noticed like what I did across country recently, like, yeah, it feels a lot harder once you go above LT2 and then it's easier again if you do it again a few weeks later. And yeah, with like training for like a 5K, I know I chuck in like a slightly faster session, a faster than LT2 session, sort of 10 to 12 days out seems to do it for me. And maybe, one more, or, like a session where most of it's threshold and then at the end there's a bit of faster stuff. That's all I need, I think, because I think if I do any more, then I actually just feel really rubbish. Yeah, so it's learning, isn't it? There's not a right answer for everyone. Yeah, I don't think I think that's substantially better, and I'd probably still rather go into a 5K having done all threshold work than having spent 2 months doing 5K pace work.
Exactly.
I think I'd race. I think the end result of the race would be better. But yeah, there's a way to blend it, and it's different for everyone, and you just got to try it, like see what happens. It might not go right, but learn from it, reflect on it.
Absolutely, yeah. I think it's more experiment a little bit based upon a good evidence starting point, I think, but then just monitor how you respond. And the secret to good coaching is just finding that balance between how much intensity you add, how much duration, and how well you're tolerating that. Just finding that sustainable training, but probably including a bit of everything in there, like every intensity domain, every zone, but where is the best emphasis placed? And I think for most people, the heavy domain is a great place to be most of the time. regardless nearly of what distance you're training for. And it's certainly a starting point for me with most of the athletes. If they're just generically trying to get fit, do consistent training, most of their sessions are going to be pretty controlled.
I reckon that's a good place to leave it.
Yeah, I reckon. So hopefully you've enjoyed that. Hopefully we've clarified zone 3 to you a little bit more, and you've come out with a bit more understanding, maybe just a marginal bit increase in understanding of threshold and heavy intensity domain in zone 3 and all these terms, which all mean slightly different and the same thing at the same time. But thanks for listening, and we'll catch you again soon.